In 1850, an enslaved woman named Harriet gave birth in a cotton field in Alabama. She had been picking cotton that morning. Her water broke around 10 a.m. The overseer allowed her to walk back to her cabin. She gave birth alone on a dirt floor with no medical assistance. 3 hours later, she was back in the field. This wasn't unusual. This was standard practice. Between 1619 and 1865, approximately 1 million enslaved children were born in America. 1 million births that occurred under conditions most of us can't imagine. 1 million women who experienced pregnancy and childbirth while enslaved. Their bodies and their babies considered property before they were even born. Today we're going to examine what plantation records, medical journals, and first-hand accounts reveal about pregnancy and childbirth under slavery. What plantation owners did, how they treated pregnant women, what happened to the babies, and what this tells us about a system that viewed human reproduction as livestock management. This isn't easy history, but it's necessary history. This is what happened when enslaved women gave birth. Plantation ledgers from the antebellum period are extraordinarily revealing documents. They list enslaved people alongside livestock, farm equipment, and land holdings. When an enslaved woman became pregnant, many plantation owners recorded it the same way they'd note a mare being bred. A typical entry might read, Betsy, age 24, field hand, with child. Expected April, value increased $200. That last part is crucial. The pregnancy increased the woman's monetary value. Not because of concern for her health or well-being, but because she was producing another piece of property. Economic historians have analyzed these plantation records extensively. The data shows that plantation owners explicitly calculated the reproductive capacity of enslaved women into their overall wealth. A woman of childbearing age was worth more than one who was past menopause, all other factors being equal. Some plantation owners engaged in what they openly called breeding programs. Historical records document plantation owners purchasing enslaved men, specifically for their physical size or strength, then forcing them to father children with multiple enslaved women. These practices are documented in plantation correspondence, legal records from estate sales, and testimonies from formerly enslaved people. One Louisiana plantation owner wrote in a letter to his brother in 1839, "I have put Sam to Ruth, Lizzie, and Mary, hoping for increase by spring." He was discussing human beings as if they were livestock breeding stock. The legal framework supported this dehumanization. In every southern state, laws explicitly stated that children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved, regardless of the father's status. This principle, partus sequitur ventrum, the child follows the condition of the mother, meant that rape of enslaved women by white men produced more enslaved children who were legal property. Medical journals from the period reveal how white doctors viewed enslaved women's reproductive capacity. They wrote about it in agricultural terms. Publications like the Southern Medical Journal contained articles discussing how to maximize productivity of enslaved women through pregnancy. One 1856 article advised plantation owners to give pregnant women moderate work until late pregnancy to ensure healthy increase. The language is clinical, detached, focused entirely on maximizing the owner's return on investment. Archaeological evidence from plantation sites reveals the physical reality behind these records. Excavations of slave quarters show that pregnant women lived in the same overcrowded, unsanitary conditions as everyone else. No special accommodations. No separate spaces for expectant mothers. The demographic data is striking. Studies of plantation birth records show that enslaved women had an average of 7 to 8 pregnancies over their lifetimes, significantly higher than white women of the same period who averaged 5 to 6. Some researchers argue this difference resulted from forced breeding, though others attribute it to lack of birth control access and earlier age of first pregnancy. What's indisputable is that pregnancy offered minimal protection from harsh treatment. Work requirements continued. Food rations remained inadequate. Living conditions didn't improve. Pregnancy wasn't viewed as a medical condition requiring care. It was viewed as a biological function that temporarily reduced labor productivity, but ultimately increased property value. This was the baseline reality from the moment of conception, that pregnancy was someone's property interest, not a developing human being deserving protection. Plantation work assignments for pregnant women varied widely depending on the owner, overseer, and economic pressures of the season. Historical records show no consistent standards or protections. Some plantation records indicate that women received lighter work assignments in late pregnancy. But lighter is a relative term when the baseline is brutal. Light work might mean weeding instead of picking cotton, hauling water instead of plowing, cooking instead of field labor. Medical research today confirms that the physical demands placed on pregnant enslaved women posed severe risks. Heavy lifting, prolonged standing, extreme heat exposure, inadequate nutrition, all are recognized risk factors for pregnancy complications, premature birth, and maternal death. Nutritional studies of documented slave diets reveal severe deficiencies in protein, iron, calcium, and vitamins essential for healthy pregnancy. The standard ration of cornmeal, salt pork, and occasionally beans provided insufficient nutrients for a pregnant woman's increased needs. Modern prenatal care recommends an additional 300 to 500 calories daily during pregnancy, along with specific nutrient supplementation. Enslaved pregnant women received no additional rations in most cases. They were expected to sustain both themselves and their developing babies on a diet already insufficient for their normal labor demands. The work didn't stop even in late pregnancy. Plantation journals document women working in the fields days before giving birth. Some overseers' logs note women giving birth and returning to work within days, sometimes within hours. One particularly chilling example comes from a Georgia plantation record from 1842. The overseer noted, "Hannah, delivered in the morning, returned to light work afternoon." The casual tone suggests this was considered normal, unremarkable. Medical complications during pregnancy went largely untreated. Plantation owners rarely paid for physician visits for enslaved women unless the pregnancy appeared to threaten the owner's property investment. Severe complications might warrant calling a doctor. Normal pregnancy discomforts, back pain, swelling, nausea, were ignored. Enslaved communities developed their own support systems out of necessity. Elderly women who had experienced multiple pregnancies served as midwives. They passed down knowledge of herbal remedies, birthing techniques, and infant care. This traditional knowledge, often rooted in African medical practices, was crucial for survival. Archaeological excavations have found evidence of these practices. Herbal remedies have been identified through residue analysis. Birthing tools made from improvised materials have been discovered. These findings confirm the historical accounts describing a parallel medical system created by enslaved people for enslaved people. The psychological stress of pregnancy under slavery is harder to document, but no less real. Modern trauma research shows that extreme stress during pregnancy affects fetal development and birth outcomes. Enslaved pregnant women lived under constant stress, fear of violence, fear of family separation, fear for their child's future, fear of the birth process itself with minimal support. Written accounts from formerly enslaved women describe this anxiety. Harriet Jacobs, in her narrative Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, wrote about the despair of bringing children into slavery. Other narratives echo this theme, the joy of pregnancy mixed with horror at the child's inevitable future. Work requirements sometimes eased slightly in the final weeks of pregnancy, but this varied enormously. Some women worked until labor began. Others were given a few days or weeks of reduced work. The decision rested entirely with the overseer or owner, based not on medical necessity, but on economic calculation. If the harvest was urgent, pregnant women worked regardless of how close they were to delivery. If labor was abundant and the pregnancy was advanced, they might receive some accommodation. The woman's health and safety were never the primary consideration. Productivity and property value were. This meant that pregnancy under slavery was not just physically dangerous, it was unpredictably so. A woman never knew whether she'd be allowed rest, whether complications would be treated, whether she'd survive childbirth. The arbitrary nature of it all compounded the trauma. When labor began, the experience varied dramatically depending on circumstances. Location, time of day, owners' policies, and available help all played roles. But certain patterns emerge from historical records. Most enslaved women gave birth in their cabins, the same overcrowded spaces they lived in. Privacy was minimal to non-existent. Other families shared the cabin. Other children were present. The birth occurred in whatever corner could be cleared. Medical documentation from the period shows that white plantation owners rarely paid for physician attendance at enslaved births unless serious complications arose. Birth was considered a natural process that didn't require medical intervention. The irony is that white women of means had physician attendance as standard practice. Instead, enslaved midwives attended births. These women learned their skills through apprenticeship with older midwives, often incorporating African birth practices with techniques learned in America. They worked with minimal tools, cloths, perhaps a knife to cut the umbilical cord, herbal preparations for pain or complications. The effectiveness of these midwives is documented in comparative mortality statistics. Some studies suggest that enslaved women attended by experienced Black midwives had survival rates comparable to or better than white women attended by white male physicians, who often used invasive interventions that increased infection risk. However, the overall maternal mortality rate for enslaved women was significantly higher than for white women. This wasn't due to midwife incompetence, but to the cumulative effects of poor nutrition, inadequate prenatal care, exhausting physical labor, and untreated health conditions. Historical records indicate maternal mortality rates for enslaved women ranged from 10 to 20 deaths per 1,000 births, roughly double the rate for white women. Infant mortality was even higher, with some estimates suggesting 25 to 35% of enslaved infants died in their first year. The immediate postpartum period was brutally short. Plantation records show that women were expected to return to work as quickly as possible after giving birth. Some owners mandated a 1-week lying-in period. Others allowed 3 or 4 weeks. Some allowed no recovery time at all. A Mississippi plantation record from 1851 states, light work may be assigned after 1 week, full work after 3 weeks post-confinement. This policy was considered generous by the standards of the time. Medical knowledge today recognizes that the postpartum period requires substantial recovery time. The uterus needs weeks to return to normal size. Vaginal or cesarean incisions need time to heal. Hormonal changes affect the body systemically. Modern medical guidelines recommend 6 to 8 weeks before returning to strenuous activity. Enslaved women got days, if they were lucky. Breastfeeding created additional complications. Infants need frequent nursing, especially in the first months. But if a mother was working in distant fields, how could she nurse? Plantation records reveal various solutions to this problem, all of them inadequate. Some plantations maintained nurseries near the fields where infants were kept. Mothers were allowed to return 2 or 3 times daily to nurse. This meant walking potentially long distances during brief breaks, nursing quickly, then returning to work with breasts still full and painful. Other plantations kept infants in the quarters, attended by elderly enslaved women or young children. Mothers might not see their babies from dawn until after sunset. Nursing was impossible under these conditions. Infants were fed crude substitutes, thin gruel, cow's milk if available, sugar water. These inadequate diets contributed to the high infant mortality rates. Some plantation owners, particularly in the Upper South where enslaved women were sometimes hired out as wet nurses, separated mothers from their own infants entirely to nurse white babies. This practice is extensively documented in plantation records and newspaper advertisements. An 1838 Virginia newspaper advertised, "For hire, Negro woman, recently confined, healthy and strong, available for wet nursing." The ad doesn't mention what happened to her own child. That wasn't considered relevant information. The emotional trauma of this system is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Postpartum depression affects many women today, even with support, adequate rest, and medical care. Enslaved women experience childbirth and its aftermath under conditions of extreme stress, exhaustion, and often forced separation from their newborns. First-person narratives from formerly enslaved women describe this anguish. One woman testified, "I birthed 6 children in slavery. I loved them all. But every time I held a new baby, all I could think was that they now belonged to master, not to me." This was childbirth under slavery. Medically dangerous, emotionally traumatic, and fundamentally dehumanizing. The moment of birth, which should be protected and celebrated, was instead just another day in a system that valued property over people. The first year of life for an enslaved infant was extraordinarily precarious. Infant mortality statistics compiled from plantation records, cemetery archaeology, and demographic studies paint a grim picture. Conservative estimates suggest that 25 to 30% of enslaved infants died before their first birthday. Some researchers argue the actual rate was higher, possibly 35 to 40%, as many early infant deaths went unrecorded in plantation ledgers. By comparison, white infant mortality in the same period was approximately 15 to 20%. While high by modern standards, it was significantly lower than for enslaved infants. The causes of this disparity are well documented. Inadequate nutrition, unsanitary conditions, disease exposure, and lack of medical care all contributed. But the underlying cause was the system itself, which didn't prioritize infant survival because infants didn't yet contribute labor. Plantation nurseries, where they existed, were barely adequate for their purpose. Archaeological excavations of these structures show them to be simple wooden buildings with dirt floors, minimal ventilation, and no sanitation facilities. Dozens of infants might be crowded into a space no bigger than a modern bedroom. Care was provided by elderly enslaved women or young children, typically one caretaker for 10 to 15 infants. These ratios made adequate care impossible. Infants cried unattended. Diapers weren't changed promptly. Illness spread rapidly in crowded conditions. The caregivers did their best with impossible circumstances, but they lacked resources, medical knowledge, and enough hours in the day. Historical accounts describe these elderly women working tirelessly, but they couldn't overcome systematic inadequacy. Nutrition for infants was fundamentally insufficient. Breast milk is optimal for infant nutrition, but as discussed, mothers often couldn't nurse adequately due to work requirements. Substitutes were poor: thin cornmeal gruel, cow's milk, which many infants couldn't digest properly, sugar water. These didn't provide necessary nutrients for healthy development. Medical records document widespread malnutrition among enslaved infants. Symptoms included failure to thrive, developmental delays, and increased susceptibility to disease. Skeletal remains from slave cemeteries show evidence of childhood malnutrition. Stunted growth, bone abnormalities, tooth enamel defects. Disease was rampant. Crowded nurseries facilitated disease transmission. Infants contracted respiratory infections, gastrointestinal diseases, and childhood illnesses that spread rapidly. Without access to medical care, many of these illnesses proved fatal. Tetanus was particularly common among enslaved infants due to unhygienic birth conditions. The umbilical cord, cut with unsterilized tools, provided an entry point for tetanus bacteria. Medical journals from the period note high rates of neonatal tetanus among enslaved infants, often described as lockjaw in Negro babies. Some plantation owners did invest in basic medical care for infants, not from humanitarian concern, but from economic calculation. An infant represented a future worker, a long-term investment. Letting too many infants die hurt the owner's economic interests. But this economic logic was limited. Infants wouldn't be productive for years. In the short term, they were liabilities, consuming resources without contributing labor. Some owners calculated that the cost of extra care exceeded the probable future value of the surviving infants. Plantation records occasionally note this calculation explicitly. One South Carolina planter wrote in 1845, "Lost 3 infants this year, 2 from flux, 1 from fever. Regrettable but not unexpected. The quarters are crowded and care is stretched thin. Cannot justify additional expense." 3 dead babies described as regrettable but not unexpected. The casual cruelty of that assessment is breathtaking. Infants who survived the first year still faced significant challenges. Weaning typically occurred around 12 to 18 months, earlier than optimal for child development. The diet shifted to cornmeal mush and whatever scraps were available. Protein deficiency was common. Growth stunting was nearly universal. By age 3 or 4, children began receiving work assignments. Light tasks initially, carrying water, gathering eggs, minding younger children. But the transition from infant to worker was already beginning. Historical accounts from formerly enslaved people describe watching their children enter the system. The anguish of knowing your child's fate, of being unable to protect them, appears repeatedly in these narratives. One woman testified, "My baby lived through his first year. I was grateful, but I knew what was coming. I knew he'd grow up in chains just like me. Sometimes I wondered if it would have been kinder if he hadn't survived. I'm ashamed I thought that, but I did." That testimony reveals the impossible emotional burden enslaved parents carried, loving their children while knowing the future held only bondage. The most disturbing aspect of reproduction under slavery was the practice of forced breeding and the subsequent sale of children away from their mothers. Both practices are extensively documented in historical records. Forced breeding occurred in 2 primary forms. First, plantation owners might compel specific enslaved people to have children together, selecting for characteristics they deemed valuable: physical size, strength, specific skills. This practice is documented in plantation correspondence, legal depositions, and testimonies from formerly enslaved people. Second, and more commonly, plantation owners created conditions that encouraged high birth rates without direct coercion. This included incentives for women who had many children, penalties for women who didn't become pregnant, and policies that kept enslaved couples together only if they were producing children. Some plantation records explicitly discuss these policies. A Louisiana plantation owner wrote in 1851, "Women who produce children regularly receive better cabin, assignments and slightly larger rations. This encourages increase and rewards productivity." He was discussing human reproduction as animal husbandry. The economic incentive for this was clear. The international slave trade had been illegal since 1808. Domestic breeding became the primary source of new enslaved workers. Children born into slavery represented pure profit for owners, no purchase price, just the cost of keeping the mother alive through pregnancy and childbirth. Demographic studies show that the enslaved population in the United States grew from approximately 700,000 in 1790 to 4 million by 1860, almost entirely through natural reproduction. This explosive growth generated enormous wealth for slaveholders. But each of those births represented a mother who watched her child become property. And many of those mothers would watch their children be sold away. The domestic slave trade separated hundreds of thousands of families. Historians estimate that approximately 1/3 of enslaved children were separated from at least one parent through sale. Many were separated from both parents. Children could be sold at any age. Plantation records document infants as young as a few months old being sold separately from their mothers. Older children were routinely sold away from families when owners needed cash or died and estates were divided. Newspaper advertisements from the period provide chilling evidence. Countless ads list Negro woman with infant or 3 children, ages 5, 7, and 9, sold separately or together. The casual tone of these advertisements, their appearance alongside ads for livestock and farm equipment, reveals how normalized this horror had become. The psychological impact on both mothers and children was devastating. Modern attachment theory and trauma research help us understand what forced separation does to human beings, particularly to children. The trauma is severe, long-lasting, and often transgenerational. First-hand accounts from formerly enslaved people describe memories of being separated from mothers. These testimonies are among the most painful in the historical record. One man recalled, "I was 7 when they sold me away. I screamed for my mama. The trader hit me to make me quiet. I never saw her again. I'm 80 years old now, and I still see her face, still hear her crying my name." Mothers' accounts are equally heartbreaking. A woman testified, "Master sold my baby girl when she was just a year old. Said he needed money for something. I begged him not to take her. He had me whipped for begging. They took her away while I was still tied to the post. I heard her crying for me. Then I couldn't hear her anymore." Some mothers resisted in desperate ways. Historical records document mothers hiding children, attempting to run away with infants. Even cases of infanticide rather than watch children sold or raised in slavery. These acts of resistance, born of absolute desperation, reveal the impossible situations these women faced. The legal framework supported all of this. Enslaved families had no legal recognition. Marriages weren't valid. Parental rights didn't exist. Children were property of the mother's owner from the moment of birth. The mother had no more legal claim to her child than to any other piece of the owner's property. Some states explicitly prohibited recognizing family relationships among enslaved people. The reasoning was clear. Recognizing families would complicate property, rights, and sales. It was economically inefficient. This system continued until emancipation. Millions of children were born into this reality. Millions of mothers experienced their babies as both their greatest joy and their greatest source of anguish. The intergenerational trauma of this system persists. Researchers studying African American family structures and trauma responses have identified patterns linked directly to slavery's destruction of families. The fear of separation, the difficulty with attachment, the protective distance some parents maintain, all can be traced back to a time when loving your child meant knowing they could be taken from you at any moment. The medical consequences of pregnancy and childbirth under slavery extended throughout women's lives. Modern medical research helps us understand what the historical record shows. Enslaved women suffered long-term damage from repeated pregnancies with inadequate care. Skeletal remains from slave cemeteries reveal evidence of this damage. Anthropological studies show high rates of pelvic deformities, spinal problems related to pregnancy and heavy labor, and bone density issues from calcium depletion during pregnancy with inadequate nutrition. Medical examinations of formerly enslaved women after the Civil War documented extensive reproductive health problems, uterine prolapse, chronic pelvic pain, damage from childbirth injuries that never healed properly, early menopause likely linked to poor nutrition and physical stress. Life expectancy for enslaved women who survived to childbearing age was approximately 35 to 40 years. Multiple pregnancies under harsh conditions contributed to premature aging and early death. The psychological trauma is harder to quantify, but no less real. Post-traumatic stress responses documented in formerly enslaved women included symptoms related to pregnancy and childbirth experiences, fear of pregnancy, nightmares about separation from children, difficulty bonding with children born after emancipation due to fear of loss. After emancipation in 1865, formerly enslaved women faced a complicated adjustment. Freedom meant their children were no longer property, that families couldn't be forcibly separated, that reproductive choices were their own. But the trauma didn't disappear with freedom. Medical care remained largely inaccessible to poor black women. Poverty meant nutrition continued to be inadequate. The physical damage from slavery years couldn't be reversed. Historical records from the Freedmen's Bureau document thousands of formerly enslaved people searching for family members after the war. Many of these searches involved mothers looking for children who had been sold away years or decades earlier. The separation notices placed in newspapers are heartbreaking. Searching for my daughter Maria, sold from Virginia to somewhere in Mississippi in 1849. She would be 20 years old now. I am free and want to find her. Some families reunited. Many never found each other. The domestic slave trade had scattered families across the South, and without records, finding someone was nearly impossible. The economic impact was also significant. Enslaved women's reproductive labor had generated enormous wealth for plantation owners, wealth that was inherited by their descendants. But the women who had given birth to all those children, whose bodies had been used as profit-generating property, received no compensation. No reparations, nothing. They entered freedom with nothing except the knowledge that their children were finally their own. That was significant, life-changing even. But it didn't erase the past or compensate for the damage. The generational impact continues. Research on African American maternal and infant health shows disparities that trace directly to slavery's legacy. Black women today are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women, even when controlling for education and income. Black infants have twice the mortality rate of white infants. These aren't just statistics. They're evidence of a system whose effects persist. Historical trauma, generational poverty, lack of access to quality medical care, implicit bias in health care, all connect to what happened to enslaved women giving birth on dirt floors while their owners calculated property value. Understanding this history is essential for understanding present-day racial disparities in maternal and infant health. The past isn't past. It's still with us. Between 1619 and 1865, approximately 1 million enslaved children were born in America. 1 million births under conditions designed to dehumanize both mother and child. Every single one of those births involved a woman experiencing pregnancy and childbirth while enslaved. A woman whose body was considered property, whose baby was property before it was even born, who had no legal rights to her own child, who might watch that child be sold away at any moment. The cruelty of this system is difficult to comprehend. But comprehend it we must, because it happened. It's not ancient history. The last person born into slavery died in the 1970s. This isn't distant past. It's barely out of living memory. The women who gave birth in these conditions demonstrated extraordinary strength. They loved their children, despite knowing those children were enslaved. They found ways to nurture and protect, despite impossible circumstances. They survived and helped their children survive. That's not minimizing what happened to them. It's acknowledging their humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. The plantation owners who created and maintained this system made deliberate choices. They chose profit over human welfare. They chose property rights over family bonds. They chose economic efficiency over basic human decency. These weren't inevitable outcomes. They were choices. And those choices generated wealth that shaped American economic development. The children born to enslaved mothers represented billions of dollars in property value. That wealth was inherited, invested, multiplied. It became generational wealth that persists today. Meanwhile, the women who gave birth to all those children received nothing. Their descendants inherited poverty, trauma, and health disparities instead of wealth. When we talk about reparations, about racial wealth gaps, about health disparities, we cannot understand any of it without understanding what happened to enslaved women giving birth. Their reproductive labor built wealth for others, while leaving them with nothing but trauma and physical damage. This history matters. These women matter. Their experiences deserve to be remembered accurately, not sanitized or forgotten. These stories are hard to hear, but they're essential to understanding American history. The women who gave birth in slavery deserve to have their experiences told truthfully and remembered fully.